This is a special presentation of the Gaming News Canada show with Steve McAllister.
Hello again, and welcome back to the Gaming News Canada show. As always, I am your host, Steve McAllister. While navigating my way through the social media platform formerly known as Twitter on a recent afternoon this week, I came across a post reporting that $250 million is being spent annually on geolocation services for regulated gambling in North America. So really perfect timing to have on the Gaming News Canada show someone who is beyond firmly entrenched on the geolocation piece of the sports wagering and iGaming industry. And with that, we welcome to the Gaming News Canada show the Managing Director, Mobile and Geolocation Specialists for Mkodo, Stuart Godfree. Stuart, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Steve. How are you doing?
Great, thanks. And ironically, this show or this podcast is a tale of two Londons. Stuart's joining us from London, the United Kingdom, and we're doing a remote version of the Gaming News Canada show this week from London, Ontario. So whatever stock you want to put on that. Hey, Stuart, I'd like to start just kind of ease into the conversation here. Just doing some research for the podcast and seeing it. Even though Mkodo might be a brand that's a little bit unfamiliar with our listeners, your company's actually been around since May 2001, and you're one of the co-founders of the company.
Yes, thanks for reminding me of that. 23 years is quite a long time to be at one company. I never thought actually I would ever be at one company for 23 years, but here I am, and I suppose I could argue that I founded it, so I got a good reason to do so. But interestingly, we started off in the very early days of text messaging. That's how Mkodo was founded. We built a B2B rules-based system. Now, if I was rebuilding that today, of course, I would say it's AI powered, like everybody else is doing. But it was a rules-based B2B platform, and basically did text messaging, and marketeers used it. And kind of for those of you who remember Crazy Frog, I don't know if you remember the Crazy Frog ringtone. Looking at you, Steve, you're probably sort of the age that probably you do remember it painfully. And for the very young people on this call, you won't, but perhaps Google it. We actually delivered a lot of ringtones and stuff like that and one of those was Crazy Frog. But we very quickly moved on, and we started to specialize in mobile websites. And for those sad people out there, they're often called WAP sites, and wireless access protocol, if you remember. And then from that, we started building out microsites. And then, but almost by accident, we created a mobile sportsbook product. And that was back in 2005. So we've been in the sportsbook and gaming space since then, basically. And then we started to get into app development. And one of, I think, the most significant things for us was the delivery of something called the iPhone. I'm sure you may have heard of it, Steve. And that was delivered by Apple in 2007. Can you believe it's 2007 that the iPhone 1 hit the market? I mean, for me, it's been there forever now, but it was in 2007 the iPhone was released. And what's really interesting is that in 2010, in fact, late 2009, but 2010, Apple allowed real money gaming applications into the App Store in certain geographies. Now, fortunately for us, one of the very first geographies that they allowed real money gaming, or RMG apps, was the UK App Store. And we were the first in there. It's one of our biggest claims to fame. We delivered a native app bingo product into the App Store in 2010. And we did that with one of our longest running clients, Mecca Bingo, part of the Rank Group. Now, what was really interesting about that, and this will all loop back, so bear with me. What was really interesting about that was Apple insisted on a geofencing solution. So we suddenly went, crikey, what is a geofencing solution? Because, I mean, geofencing, even as a term, wasn't really well known in those days. So we built out a relatively straightforward geo-compliance platform that basically prevented people using the app outside the British Isles, the UK Isles. And what's actually interesting, the UK Isles included Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, and also, surprisingly, Gibraltar, for a very obscure reason. Because technically speaking, Gibraltar, and I know the Spanish will argue this, is part of the United Kingdom. from a territorial point of view. So we had to kind of build out this geo compliance platform that didn't leverage the concept of being in the UK, because, as I say, Gibraltar is territorially in the UK, but physically, of course, it's not. So we had to build out quite a complex system. And then from then on, we've been doing geo compliance solutions basically since that date. Now, the difference, I think, between us and a number of the other organizations who do geo compliance is that we only supplied our services to our customers, so to those people who were taking apps and mobile websites from us, and we never offered it as a general product offering. But back in 2018, we started providing services to Ontario Lottery Group, including our Geo product. And as you may know, while you're in London, in Ontario, the Ontario market opened up a few years ago. And it was at that point that we decided that actually we must share our technology as good people that we are. And so we commercialized and productized our geolocation platform as a separate entity and branded it Geo Locs. So that's a very potted history of how it came to market. But one of our other claims to fame is we've been the longest running geo compliance organization in the betting and gaming lottery space since 2010.
Is it fair to say then, Stuart, that you've been watching North America pretty closely for a long time? I mean, we're 6 years now since PASPA was overturned in the U.S., where we're just over 2 years into the regulated Ontario market now. I'm thinking that a company like Mkodo was just waiting for an expansion of regulated gaming in North America to expand your business.
Yeah, I mean, we've been very, very, very successful in Ontario. We do more than half of all the geolocation lookups in Ontario. Now, part of that, to be fair and to be realistic, is because the largest player in that space is OLG, and they leverage our platform extensively. But we've been very successful in Ontario when we're driving now into North America. Now, what's quite interesting, of course, is that North American market has quite a different viewpoint on the complexities of geolocation than, for example, the UK, Canada, France, Germany, etc. And there's much more of a significant onus on the operator for culpability and responsibility than there is in Europe. So if I'm trading in Europe and I'm betting on a site in Europe and I try and spoof my location, there is an onus on the operator to do everything reasonable to prevent that. But fundamentally, it comes down to fraud on the individual. In the US, it's a different ballgame. It's much more that the onus is much more on the operator, and the responsibility is much more on the operator due to the Federal Wire Act. So it is effectively a federal offence by the operator to support a bet that is out of state. So you have to be much more. It has to be a much more sophisticated and unfortunately a much more onerous product on the individual, especially from a data privacy point of view.
I was going to say, I mean, it sounds like innovation obviously is key to your business. And again, you talked a few minutes ago, Stuart, about the iPhone coming in 2007, and it made me think back to the early 90s when I was working for the National Hockey League Players Association, and during a labor dispute, carrying two of the great big 3-pound cell phones back in the day, and then thought it was so neat when flip phones came, and thought I died and gone to heaven when the BlackBerry came around in the late 90s and early 2000s, and of course we see where we are today, and I remember people telling me 10 years ago that nobody would ever watch a live sporting event on a phone, and of course we know where that's gone. But how do you, again, with the one thing about geolocation, you're kind of always trying to stay one step ahead of the people who want to commit fraud or commit wrongdoing, and that's just not a geolocation in the gambling industry, but in other areas as well. As how has your company been able to kind of stay ahead of the curve?
Well, actually, there's actually two things that we have to stay ahead of. One of course is the bad actors who try and actually a lot of these guys aren't really bad actors. They just want to place a bet. So they're sitting in their hotel room in a state that they don't normally operate out of, right? So they may be living in New Jersey. They want to place a bet, but let's say they're in California, they're in San Francisco for whatever reason, and it's the case they can't because they're now out of state. And it's, well, why can't I? And I think one of the really interesting things is, and this is the kind of complexity of the provincial/state model that we tend to see in Canada and the US, is that people don't appreciate that there is restrictions on certain activities in different states. A really, really good example of that today is that the regulated, deregulated market, however you want to phrase it, in Ontario, has created a scenario in Canada where everybody in Canada now believes that online betting is allowable globally across Canada. Right. So, if you look at some of the major players, they've got licenses in Ontario, but technically speaking, their grey market in British Columbia. Yeah, they're advertising on TV. They're all on the hockey matches in all on Toronto-based TV, and so they just say, well, it's on Toronto-based TV. I can see it in that hockey match. Why can't I bet in British Columbia with that operator? And that is similar to what we're seeing in the US. So a lot of these guys aren't necessarily bad actors. They just don't understand that there are restrictions, and certain states in the US forbid both betting and gaming. And actually several, I mean, California's a really good example of that. Depending on who you talk to, it's the 5th, 6th, or 7th largest economy on the planet, but it doesn't allow you to buy your lottery ticket online. So let's not get too much into that. But so the bad actors are often people who are just trying to do something that they can legitimately do in their home state, but now can't do something on their traveled to states. So that's one of the things we have to kind of prohibit. And generally, we find actually their attempt at location fraud is relatively simplistic. Then, of course, we do get the very bad actors who are trying to do bets out of state, and sometimes because they have insight into that sporting event, which is exactly what the Wire Act was there to try and prohibit, right? In the very early days, the telegraph going from New York, in fact, over to California. That's originally how it came to bear. So we have to work on that. And then the other side we have the platform and the browser providers who are doing everything they possibly can to support the rights of privacy of their users. And although we're great exponents of privacy at Mkodo, we're a European organization fundamentally, and therefore we have this thing called GDPR at forefront that we have to always be mindful of. But we have to also be mindful that we cannot extract huge amounts of personal data out of a person's machine just to make sure they are in California or not. So it's a challenge that we have, and fundamentally we just have to put dollars into research and development constantly. We have a sizable team, like the majority of my competitors in this market, just to keep ahead of the curve.
It's pretty much, you talk to anybody who works in a regulated environment, Stuart, whether it's a sportsbook operator or a company like Mkodo, and it's universal, the feeling that the more regulation, the better. Has Mkodo played a role in Canada? Again, you mentioned British Columbia. I mean, obviously there's a very, very robust technology sector in British Columbia in the gambling sector, and we see Alberta as probably, there's discussions on now for Alberta to adopt some semblance of the Ontario model probably within the next 2 years, and people, operators are quite keen to see regulated gambling in Quebec. Is Mkodo playing a role in pushing for that regulation, or I'll just give you the platform right now to make your case why regulation is a good thing?
Well, I think fundamentally regulation is a good thing. There's obviously levels and variances of regulation. Okay, which I mean, let's face it. Most operators will always say that there's too much regulation. Okay. We're going to because it creates a level of restriction in the way that we can operate. And I think we also have to be very, very mindful that the more you regulate, potentially you squeeze people into the grey and the black spaces in this marketplace. So we've got to be careful that if we over-regulate, we actually effectively force people into unregulated markets. That's the kind of irony. And I think actually that's one of the challenges we're seeing in the UK right now. Our regulator is making some considerable movements into being implementing quite restrictive gambling practices. And although some of it from a responsible gaming point of view, I'm very aligned to, some of the other items they're trying to do, I think will just force people onto the grey market. And the problem with the grey and the black market in particular is we know that that's heavily influenced by crime. And so this is something that I'm quite concerned about, actually, and where geolocation, ironically, can actually be quite a good influencer in helping with that regulation. But as to your original question, yes, we're involved with the regulators. We try and influence them. I mean, we try to influence in more to the case of what is practical and what is sensible. And one of the things I mentioned a little bit earlier, this is this thing called GDPR, and in Canada you have your own implementation of GDPR, but it's very similar. But one of the critical things about data protection is that you should only take the amount of information from the customer that you need to do to provide the service. That's one of the kind of core tenets of GDPR. You have that same tenet with inside your data privacy in Canada. And interestingly, that even though the US doesn't have the same concept of data protection laws, because it's in their statute, people in America are again very, very sensitive about data protection. You've seen, in fact, the platform providers, Apple in particular, they wouldn't share information with the CIA and the FBI in a recent case, because they do believe that the tenet, the fundamental tenet that you own your own data, your data is private to you, is extremely important to them as a business, and obviously to the people they sell their phones to. And we're aligned to that. However, we have to measure that with what the regulators are expecting of us, and that is always the challenge. And if you look at often at what the regulators are asking for, fundamentally we can't do it. We can't do it unless we install extremely invasive code onto somebody's machine, and that is very much against what Mkodo is about as an organization. So we have different ways of getting around that. Some of it creates slightly more speed bumps in the user journey, but fundamentally what we're about is trying to make sure that the operator is protected, and so is the customer from a data privacy point of view.
Hey, Stuart, you sit in a unique position because you've been in the industry for almost a quarter of a century now, and you're.
Don't remind me, Steve.
Well, I think I probably have a few years on you, Stuart. So please feel younger for sure on this podcast. But just having experience working in those different jurisdictions, and you mentioned the UK earlier, and France and the US, like just some broad thoughts on the Ontario model, and what you like about it, and what are some things that maybe could be a little bit better.
It's a nice question. I appreciate you asking that, because I think it's a really good one. So I have to say, I generally do like working in Canada and the US from a regulatory point of view and the operational point of view. And you might be surprised to hear that. Number one, the regulators that I work with in Canada in particular are very open. They listen, whether they act on what I say to them when I talk to them, but they're very open. And in fact, their regulatory process, although extremely painful, I don't know whether you've actually gone through the regulatory process with a regulator in Canada, but it's quite invasive, personally, to me and to my company. But they do it in a Canadian way, which is generally polite and what have you. In Europe, the regulatory process is much more painful, much more through a particular process. A lot of humanity is taken out of it, and it's either you do this or disappear. And really, they're not receptive to any form of input at all. So it is quite difficult to try and steer a regulator. And, basically, if you go down that direction, you're going to kill the industry. They're not particularly interested. They are much more influenced by what government wants them to do rather than what the industry is able to do. So as I say, I really do like working in that space. And one of the things I do like about the US market is that every operator I've worked with in the US really gets and understands responsible gaming. There are a number of operators that we've been challenged with, we've had work with in the past in Europe, who have a very light view on responsible gaming. And I think if we're going to protect our industry, we have to be mindful that ultimately you can't over farm the field, right? So if you continuously farm and plow that field, ultimately that field will go barren. And so the regulation and responsible gaming is there to prevent the bad actors in the industry doing that, and allowing the responsible actors to operate in a fair and even environment. So again, I do commend what both the Canadian and the US regulators are doing, and I wish I could see a little bit more of that perhaps in the UK and some other geographs in Europe.
Hey, Stuart, I'd just like to follow up with you on the responsible gaming piece, because I think operators are under fire right now. Particularly, I think we've seen this in the UK, and we're certainly seeing this in North America, where there's a belief out there in some corners that the industry is just paying lip service when it comes to responsible gambling. Can you, I guess, offer rebuttal to that?
Well, I think I think the detractors in the industry are always going to be saying that, and I think one of the things is that people do want to gamble. I mean, let's face it, nobody forces somebody to go onto a Bet365 website. And I look forward to the commission for mentioning Bet365, or on Play Now in British Columbia, or OLG site, or what have you. Nobody forces those people to go onto that site. They choose to go onto that site. Once they're onto that site and gambling, I mean, even buying a lottery ticket is a gambling act. And this is one of the interesting things, is that most people who buy a lottery ticket or who play bingo don't think they're gamblers. They think they're just punters, but of course they are considered to be gamblers. But as soon as they are on that site and gambling, the operator has a responsibility for that person. I don't think anybody would argue against that. All my customers, because we only work in regulated markets, I believe very strongly that all my clients consider responsible gambling, responsible gaming to be their number one tenant in how they operate as a business, because they know that if they try to abuse that trust with the customer, they're going to lose the customer, but more importantly, they're going to damage their industry. So, but there are these people, these protractors out there, who don't really care about the long-term viability of the industry. They just want the profit now. And that's really where the regulator and responsible gaming comes in. It's to protect the industry from those bad operators, and that's the thing we're all challenged with. And if you think about it, those guys are the ones who tend to get the fines. And although sometimes big key players in the industry get a fine because they've made some level of mistakes, but also it's a kind of flag up the flagpole by the regulator, say, we're watching you behave. And it's a shame actually that needs to happen. But of course, some operators perhaps are slightly operating in an area they shouldn't, or more to the point, I think often their processes are just not quite up to where they need to be.
Want more exciting content and exclusive insights? Subscribe to the Homestand Sports Today newsletter at homestandsports.com.
I want to talk for a few minutes, Stuart, about the user experience and the role that a company like Mkodo plays in that. Because again, you talk to, we go to conferences and you talk to operators, they talk about the importance of product and customers being able to easily place a bet or play an online game easily, or even the registration process. Like where does Mkodo fit into that puzzle?
Well, there's two sides to our business. So the one side of our business, which we're kind of talking about now, is geolocation compliance. Okay, and as I say, we've been in that space since 2010, and we have a great deal of experience about it. The other side of our business is developing apps and websites in the betting and gaming and lottery space, and that's kind of historically, and that actually was the thing that created the geofencing product in the first place. So really good user experience is what we're about. That's you cut us in half and we bleed good user experience. That's what we are as a business. So one of the things, when we are developing our geolocation compliance platform, the very thing that we're thinking always about is what is the height of the speed bump that geo compliance is putting in front of the user, and how we can minimize that. Because there's two aspects here. One is, nobody likes to be asked where their location is. I'm sure we've all gone to websites, particularly websites that are using some form of Google tracking, and they've enabled the location. You get this pop-up saying it wants your location, and you're going, I'm buying a pair of shoes. Why does it need to know my location, right? And you go reject, deny, won't allow. Now, we can't allow people to do that on a gambling site because we need to know their location. So how can we deliver that request in a meaningful way that creates as little friction as possible to the consumer? Okay, and that's really what we're about, and that's one of the reasons why we've been so successful in Ontario. Our solution is without doubt the lowest friction solution out there, to the point that a number of our competitors have now seen what we're doing and are copying it. Flattery, I suppose, right? So, the challenge we have is, particularly in the US, is we have to have quite a high level of friction to accommodate the regulations that we have in the US, and that is the biggest challenge we have right now. How can we create low friction but deal with the regulatory requirements of locating somebody accurately?
That kind of takes me back to your comment earlier about regulation being on a state by state basis or province by province, and how much easier it would be if there was just a national standard, because I think that is a pain point not just for operators but companies like Mkodo, when New Jersey has a different set of regulations than New York or Massachusetts or Michigan. And I assume we'll probably have the same thing here in Canada as regulated gambling expands. That the standards in Alberta will probably be a little bit different than Ontario. So that's a pain point for sure.
Oh, I mean, without doubt. I mean, one thing that we're quite, in some ways, I'm sure you're familiar with GLI. So GLI have a couple of standards that they implement. One's called GLI 33 for sports, and one's called GLI 19 for gaming, iGaming, lottery, etc. And they stipulate a set of kind of standards, they're GLI standards for how as a business, as an operator, you should go about delivering sportsbook or lottery, iGaming. And then inside that, they say how you should do geolocation. And some of it actually is a little bit dated because it talks a lot about IP, which is completely untrustworthy nowadays. You just can't use IP location. It's bonkers. And I'm still amazed how many people keep on talking about IP location, but they do. Anyway, let's move on. But the GLIs set a level of kind of agreed standards that a lot of operators are using. They may not refer to GLI 33 as an example, but they copy and paste it into their own regulatory controls. So there is a kind of a broad standard, and what we generally do is we track these standards and make sure that our product is configurable for each state by broadly using that overlay standard set, and to a greater or lesser degree, fundamentally, you need to get the geolocation data out, validate it that it's genuine data, make sure the person is in the area that they need to be, and bingo. Now, I made it sound very simple. Like, believe me, it's not. But fundamentally, from a regulatory point of view, that's what you need to do, and then just have an audit trail.
This podcast, we track kind of our audience as a mix of people who've been around, like yourself, been around the industry for a long time, and also people like myself who are relatively new and trying to learn the industry. Can you maybe just walk our audience through a little bit more through the Geo Locs product and what it does and perhaps the evolution of it?
Yeah, of course. So as I mentioned very early on in this podcast, it fundamentally originally came out of a desire to create a geofencing solution for Apple apps in the gaming, in the real money gaming space, RMG as we tend to call it. So we've evolved it because if you think about it, it's not just apps that you need, it's websites and whatnot. So what we've done over the many years is built effectively a series of SDKs, software development kits. For those of you not familiar with those, it's just a bunch of compiled code that you install with some documentation and what have you to tell you how to do it or show you how to do it. And so we have SDKs for iOS, SDKs for Android, SDKs for cross-platform versions, including Xamarin, and we have an SDK for web-based products. So you just basically insert those libraries into your app, into your website. It's extremely straightforward, and for most of the developers in this world who use something called an IDE or an integrated development environment, you kind of just drag and drop it in, and then pretty much the rest of it is all configured in our portal. And I think one of the key things for us is all about self-management. We have a portal platform that you log into, and you can configure your service there. You can set up your regions that you want people to be accessible to. So a really good example, you would import our Ontario map, which is basically what we call GIS data. It's actually the GIS data that's from Data Canada, slightly modified because Ontario is a really good example. And this is a bit of trivia for you, Steve, down the pub on Friday night, is that the Ontario border is actually on the beach of Ontario on Toronto side, not in the lake, but the lake actually borders America. So believe it or not, you can gamble in the lake, providing you're on the Canadian side and not on the American side. But that lake actually isn't in Ontario. So a little bit of nuance there. But fundamentally, you import that data into the system, and away you go.
Stuart, you realize there's now going to be people rushing out to buy boats for the summer.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's much nicer to gamble on the beach because you can get a beer and an ice cream and whatnot. It's a bit more difficult on the boat, perhaps. But anyway, but that's fundamentally how it works. And the whole point really behind it is that our customers can self-manage their whole geolocation compliance piece, including for their development teams, their QA teams. And one of the big issues that we've always seen in this market is I've got a geo-compliance platform. I've implemented it. So how do I get my test team that's not in the state, not in the province, to test that product and prove it works? And one of my amusing things was I was speaking to a developer latter part of last year who's really giving me a hard time, saying every time I go to test this, it says I'm out of location. And I said to him, well, where are you testing it from? And he says, well, I'm in Malta. So I said, but the geolocation area is Ontario. What do you expect? Well, I expect I can test it in Malta. Well, it's a geo-compliance platform. Of course, and it's one of the, just because you're the developer doesn't mean that the compliance system should suddenly turn itself off because you're the developer. And that's part of the challenges that often you have with geo-compliance platforms is how do you test things, right? So as we come from everything from an app and web development background as a business, we realize that we have test teams who suffer this on a daily basis. So our platform is very, very adaptive to allow specific test teams to test the scenarios as if they were in Ontario, and when they move to production, those magically get turned off. And that's part and parcel of what we're about, that you own the testing environment. You don't have to send an email into an organization that will whitelist you magically and what have you. You can just manage that entirely yourself. And that's one of the real virtues of our platform.
You mentioned earlier that OLG is a client. You're also working with Casumo and Betty Gaming. We had Justin Park, CEO of Betty, on the podcast a month or so ago. Without giving away any state secrets, Stuart, like what are the conversations that you have with those partners as you work together? And are there weekly check-ins between your tech people and their tech people? How does that relationship work?
Yeah, we don't have. So we have an account management team who check in regularly with all our. I personally don't check in with them very much at all. OLG, I speak to the compliance team more frequently because they're a significant client of us. We build their apps as well. But one of I think the interesting things about that is we're always learning. We're a fairly agile organization. We are. I don't think we should be too ashamed of it. We're heavily tech driven and tech led, and so part of what you were asking a little bit earlier is how do we keep up in the arms race of bad actors and technology changes and platform changes, and we have to do that. But one of the interesting things is when I'm talking to my clients, it's kind of and always this is the situation is what itch do you need me to scratch? Right. What are the problems that you are suffering? Is it reporting to the regulator? So how do you get your automated weekly and monthly reports? Is that something that's killing you? How do you determine bad actors? One of the big things that we're seeing in the market is where people are using same devices, multiple accounts. So they are taking advantage, for example, of free bets, promo options. So they sign up, get a $50 free bet. Sign up, get a $50 free bet. Sign up, get a $50 free bet. Now you might think, what's the harm of that? Each one of those $50 free bets costs the operator $50. It's to them and to their accounting system. That's real cash, right? It's not just magic money, it's real cash. So they want to stop that, what we call promo fraud. So how do you stop promo fraud? Well, generally it happens in the identical location, right? So if we can track location of behavior of location, we can indicate to our clients that there is potential fraud event going on. Now, it's not location fraud, which is what we're about, right? But it's promo fraud. It's fraud associated with the service. So location compliance isn't just about making sure somebody is somewhere in Ontario, whether they're on the beach or on the boat in Lake Ontario. It's also about what their behavior in that location area. And so these are sort of things that our clients come to us and say, can you help us with that? And of course, yes, we can. And that not only does that evolve our product, potentially makes our product more viable, more competitive in the marketplace, but it also helps them as a business to maintain and manage their costs. So their costs aren't just about how much they're paying me to do a location lookup. It's how much money I can potentially help them and save them from fraudulent activities, whether it's promos or whether it's people who have stolen their sister's credit card and so on and so forth, which is an incident we had in British Columbia, by the way. So it's those types of things that we can also help our clients with, and we do that from the kind of feedback and the discussions that we have with them.
It's become a standard question on the podcast lately, Stuart, and so I'm going to ask you, and it just where does artificial intelligence fit in with Mkodo's business? And hopefully the AI is not a four-letter word.
Well, I have to say, and maybe this is not the appropriate time for a podcast, but I could talk forever about the whole concept. So I've been in the industry for absolutely years, and not just. I'm a technologist. My background is electronic engineering, believe it or not, and I won't tell you how I got into the software space because that's another story. But we've been building a kind of so originally in engineering parlance, you didn't have anything called AI. We had rules-based stuff. Then we had machine learning, and now we got AI. And actually, if you look at a lot of what the AI solutions are, I'm not talking so much about Chat GPT. That's a different type of thing. But if you look at what a lot of people are saying, and I now see my competitors who suddenly overnight have got AI technology. And I'm sorry, I'm an old man. I'm cynical, right? It's just a rebranding exercise, and we are looking at how we can use intelligent profiling. Now, whether you want to call that AI or not, and I will always probably try and defer my marketing folks inside Mkodo that we're not just going to brand everything AI because it's cool right now. We're going to brand everything in the manner that it is what it does. So intelligent profiling is what we are looking at and what we're developing. And I gave you an example just a moment ago about, are we seeing behavior in the same zonal area, for example? And because that is where the majority of fraud is being realized in specific areas. You see hotspots of fraud, which is generally a group of people, maybe an individual with multiple devices, who are creating levels of fraud, and whether that's promo fraud, credit card fraud, duplicate account fraud, or whatever. And that's the type of thing that we're focusing, if you want to call it AI, but intelligent profiling. That's the type of thing we are focusing this technology on.
Hey, Stuart, last question, and if I missed it in your comments earlier, I apologize. But I do believe that Mkodo rolled out a new feature at the SBC Summit North America earlier this month, and I unfortunately wasn't able to make it this year. But I was hoping you could maybe chat about that before we let you go.
Yeah, I sort of slightly mentioned it without naming it. So we have this thing we call our Geo Authentication platform, and fundamentally, there's a couple of interesting things right now. Is the majority of, for example, the majority of sports book bet placements happen on mobile devices, and you can speak to different people, but the numbers are upwards of 70%. So generally, if you're below 70%, you're not doing a very good job with your sportsbook, your mobile sportsbook. So more than 70% of all sportsbook bet placements happen on a mobile phone. And so that's, and generally that happens on a mobile phone app for lots of reasons. One is the geo information you can get out of a mobile phone is sweet. We can do a lot of work to make sure that we can trust that geolocation data. Where we have a problem is where people are using another type of a device, such as a desktop browser. That's a really good example. People want to use desktop browsers, particularly the more experienced bettor. And I'm sure most of the people who are listening to this podcast know what I mean, but they will have multiple browser windows open. They will be anonymous browsing type windows as well. And they will be looking at bets from all the different sort of betting providers, and they will be choosing, and they will have multiple accounts, okay, and they will be choosing where they strike their bet, where they place their bet. And some of them will also be trying to work out if they can place their bet on a different operator in a different state where they are. Okay. Now, the problem we have with that is quite often we cannot get accurate geolocation data out of that browser. So what we will do is we will block them. We will say insufficient ability to trust your device. And the way our system works, and the majority of our competitors work in the same way, it's not just the geolocation data that we're interested in, it's how we get it, how the device gives us that information. Now, the problem with that also is there's people who are legitimate players that get affected by that. And they are probably not the more serious punters, but those are people that we want to support. So if I'm on a desktop device that's on a Starlink connection and your IP address is telling us that you are somewhere in space, clearly I'm not going to trust your location, right? So how can I get location data out of that customer robustly? Well, if they have a mobile phone next to their desktop, I can use the mobile phone to geolocate them. And that's what our GeoAuth platform does. It basically links the two products together during your betting or your gaming session. We can trust the location on the mobile phone super accurately. There's lots of reasons why I won't bore you too much with all that. And that's what we do. And we basically pair the two devices together. It's quite exciting technology because we're also using that as a pilot for one of our customers to actually do multi-factor authentication through it as well. So not only do I get geo compliance from you, I get bio logging compliance from you. And that is, and although this blog isn't really about authentication, but it's a big issue in sportsbook particularly, but gaming generally, is about how do I know that the person logging in is Steve McAllister? How do I know it's you, right? It could be your son, your daughter, your wife, your next door neighbor who's somehow got your phone, what have you. And so this is a big thing in the business, in the industry right now. And it's all about really bio identity. How, forget about AI in this space. Right now, the big hot button is how do I know that the person who's logging in with Steve A with the password 1234 is actually Steve McAllister, right? And it's the bio identity is the crucial piece, and that will also help to prevent fraud.
And it's certainly been a topic of conversation with some of the pro athletes in North America we've seen lately who have been suspended or banned for betting violations, and conversations around whether or not it was them actually using somebody using the account on their behalf, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's a big thing, and maybe that's for a different subject. But we see that the whole there's a big thing particularly in lottery. It's called attestation. It's basically proving you are who you are, and that you're able to, for example, buy a lottery ticket. And one of the big challenges right now is how do I know that person is that person from a digital point of view, if I'm buying a lottery ticket online. But the other big issue is if I go into a sports bar or a retail outlet to buy a lottery ticket or to place a sports bet, again, how does that operator know that I am legitimate, that the funds came from my bank account, that I am the right person, that I'm of sane mind, etc. How do you do that? But also, how do you do that in a way that maybe you're not sharing too much of your private data? Okay, and so one of the reasons to do that is basically to have something that speaks for you. So having some level of digital identity that will corroborate who you are, but doesn't give too much information over to the retailer, is kind of the sweet spot that a lot of betting, gaming, lottery organizations are looking at today.
Before we let you go, I want to also mention, Stuart, that you are going to be in Toronto next month at the Canadian Gaming Summit, and you're going to be appearing on a panel that I'm definitely going to attend, and that's kind of looking at new approaches to traditional verticals. And it's actually a great panel that's been put together. Lloyd Danzig from Sharp Alpha Advisors, who was on the podcast last week, will be joining you. BD Gaming CEO Colin Cole Johnson.
Yep.
Will be there as well, and Bill Pascal, who I've had a chance to listen to Bill at other conferences, who's been a loud and eloquent advocate for expanded online gaming across the U.S. and various states. So that's certainly a panel that I would recommend people sit in. I think that's on the Wednesday of the conference on June 19th.
That's correct. It is. Yeah.
Stuart Godfree is the Managing Director, Mobile and Geolocation Specialists at Mkodo. Stuart, so glad that we had a chance to speak, to meet each other from two different Londons on the globe. And listen, look forward to seeing you in person in Toronto next month and to learn more about the Mkodo business.
Yes, Steve, it's been a pleasure, and I'm sure the traffic in my London is significantly worse than the traffic in your London. But I look forward to catching up with you in Toronto in a few weeks' time. And I think that panel is actually going to be pretty exciting. I know most of the people on that panel, and they're industry veterans. They really know what they're talking about. So let's hope we have a good one.
You can find all the episodes of the Gaming News Canada show at gamingnewscanada.ca or on the various podcast platforms. Again, we thank Stuart Godfree for joining us, and also we'll give a shout out to Samantha Hildyard at Mkodo for making Stuart available for today's episode. And we look forward to getting together with everybody real soon.
Okay, thanks again, Steve. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Gaming News Canada show. Sign up for our newsletter at gamingnewscanada.ca. Follow Steve McAllister on LinkedIn. Message Steve if you're interested in being a sponsor or featured guest.